The wind howls through the ruined French countryside, a hollow, ragged sound that seems to scrape across the broken walls of empty villages. Smoke drifts low to the ground, twisting around the corpses of tanks half buried in mud. It is dawn, 1944. Somewhere between Metz and the Moselle River, a small group of American soldiers, no more than 100 men, stand in formation on a deserted road. Their uniforms are smeared with soot, their faces gray from exhaustion and fear. Behind them, trucks rattle with the echo of distant artillery, carrying equipment so strange, so secret that not even nearby Allied divisions know what it is. A captain in a battered helmet raises his hand. His men, artists, actors, sound engineers, designers, not ordinary soldiers, begin to move. They unroll giant loudspeakers from the backs of jeeps. They string up camouflage nets and fake radio antennas. On the hills, they inflate entire battalions of rubber tanks. The air smells of diesel and damp earth. In the distance, thunder rolls. No, not thunder. The growl of approaching panzers. The German 11th Panzer Division, armored and merciless, closing in fast. And yet these Americans are not here to fight. They are here to deceive. Within the next 24 hours, this handful of men will convince the enemy that a full U.S. division, thousands of soldiers, tanks and artillery, lies waiting for them in these hills. If they fail, the Germans will tear through this line like paper. But if they succeed, history itself may never know their names. As the morning sun cuts through the fog, the captain whispers into his radio, "Let's give them a show." The story of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops begins not on the battlefield, but in the echoing halls of art schools, advertising agencies, and theater stages scattered across America. Before the war, these men painted billboards, designed fashion prints, crafted posters for Broadway plays. They were illustrators for Vogue, architects of urban skylines, set designers for movie studios. When Pearl Harbor was attacked in 1941, many of them enlisted like everyone else and expecting rifles, trenches, and glory. What they got instead was a secret unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever attempted. In 1942 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, Colonel Harry L. Reeder was handed a peculiar assignment. The Army wanted to create a unit whose sole mission was deception. A phantom army, capable of confusing and misleading the enemy on a massive scale. This was not just camouflage. This was psychological warfare. Theater, sound, and illusion weaponized. Reeder gathered officers from the Signal Corps, engineers, and the camouflage branch. What emerged over the next year would be officially known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, 1,100 men trained not to kill, but to make the enemy believe. The recruits who arrived were nothing like typical soldiers. Some had sketchbooks instead of notebooks. Others carried rolls of tracing paper. Bill Blass, who would later become a world-famous fashion designer, stood shoulder to shoulder with Ellsworth Kelly, a future modernist painter. Jack Mazey, who had once designed stage sets in New York, now found himself drawing blueprints for fake tanks. Their weapons were air compressors, paintbrushes, and microphones. Their mission, to turn the art of deception into a battlefield advantage. By the time the unit shipped out for Europe in 1944, they carried with them an arsenal of illusions. Inflatable Sherman tanks that could be erected in 20 minutes. Dummy artillery with collapsible barrels. 2.5-ton trucks fitted with massive loudspeakers capable of projecting sound for miles, the sonic units, and radios that could mimic the transmissions of entire divisions, the spoofers. Their equipment filled dozens of trucks, each disguised as a regular signal or engineer vehicle. Their motto unofficially whispered between the men, "We fool the enemy, not ourselves." When they landed in Normandy, the war was already tearing through the continent. The beaches were littered with the wreckage of the invasion. The men of the 23rd followed behind the front lines, moving invisibly in the shadows of great battles. They never stayed long in one place. Their work was done before the fighting began, setting the stage, drawing the enemy's gaze away from the true attack. They became ghosts of war, appearing where no real division existed, vanishing before the first shot was fired. Their first major operation came in France, near the town of Brest. The Germans held a stubborn pocket of resistance along the coast, and the 6th Armored Division was ordered to encircle it. But to distract the enemy from the real maneuver, the 23rd was sent south, to pretend to be the 6th. Overnight, they transformed empty fields into a convincing camp. Trucks were lined up with painted unit insignias, fake artillery pointed toward the enemy. Radio operators chattered endlessly into static. Meanwhile, sound engineers played pre-recorded tracks of tanks rumbling, soldiers shouting, hammers clanging. To an enemy scout listening from miles away, it sounded like a full division preparing for assault. And it worked. The Germans diverted units to confront a phantom army, buying precious time for the real 6th Armored Division to strike from the flank. It was the first time the 23rd had tested their illusions under fire, and it wouldn't be the last. Among the men, fear and pride mixed uneasily. They knew their job was dangerous. To deceive the enemy, they often had to position themselves within range of German artillery, close enough to be believable. And yet they carried almost no real weapons. Their survival depended entirely on the strength of the lie they created. At night, they gathered around small fires, listening to distant gunfire and wondering if anyone would ever know what they'd done. "We're the only outfit," one soldier wrote in a letter home, "that fights a war without firing a shot. And if we do our job right, nobody even knows we were there." As the war moved eastward, their illusions grew bolder. They impersonated entire divisions, the 2nd Armored, the 9th, the 75th Infantry. They built fake command posts, installed phony generals, and even sent patrols of actors dressed as military police to direct traffic, reinforcing the illusion for anyone who passed through. Every detail mattered: the right patches on their sleeves, the correct vehicles parked in the right order. Even the paint on their helmets had to match the division they were pretending to be. But deception, like art, thrives on precision. And soon their most dangerous test would come, the day when a single mistake could mean death for hundreds of men. It was in the cold autumn of 1944, near the French-German border, when intelligence warned of a Panzer Division preparing to strike through the Lorraine region. The 4th Armored Division needed time to reposition. The 23rd was ordered to take their place, to fool the Germans into believing that a strong armored force was waiting in the hills. What they didn't know was that the Germans weren't just listening, they were already coming. The fog that rolled over Lorraine that October morning felt alive, thick, damp, and clinging to the soldiers' faces like breath from the earth itself. It muffled the sound of boots and engines, swallowing every movement into silence. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops had arrived during the night, slipping quietly into an empty sector between Nancy and Metz, a gap left by the withdrawing 4th Armored Division. On maps, it was a weak point in the Allied line. To the Germans, it looked like opportunity. To the 23rd, it looked like a stage. Captain Ralph Ingersoll, a wiry man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried through static, crouched over a damp map spread across the hood of a Jeep. Around him, a handful of officers, sound engineers, radio men, and camouflage artists, waited for orders. Their faces glowed faintly under red-lensed flashlights. "We've got 48 hours, Ingersoll murmured. "That's all. If they probe, we're done. But if we can sell it, if they believe a full armored division is sitting right here, we buy Patton time to move his tanks." He tapped the map, a finger pressing into a small ridge near the Moselle River. "This is where they'll look first. I want tanks there by dawn, at least 30. Get the inflatables up before first light." The men moved like stagehands between acts. Trucks ground through the mud, headlights blacked out, carrying folded rubber tanks that smelled of latex and oil. Each inflatable Sherman weighed barely 100 pounds when packed. Within 20 minutes, with air compressors roaring softly in the dark, they would swell into full size, barrel, turret, and all. The illusion of steel created from nothing but fabric and air. The night filled with strange, soft shapes rising out of the mist. Like ghosts of machines, by sunrise, the empty hills were transformed. To anyone peering through binoculars from across the valley, it looked like an armored camp. Rows of Sherman tanks rested under camouflage nets. Trucks stood in formation. Artillery barrels pointed east. Men walked between vehicles, appearing busy and purposeful. Except most of those men weren't soldiers. They were artists, radio men, and designers dressed in uniforms stitched with fake insignia. Their rifles were props. Their war was performance. The 23rd divided their deception into 3 acts. First came visual camouflage, the fake tanks and vehicles, the dummy guns, the phony headquarters tents. Second came sonic illusion. Recordings of engines, hammers, shouted orders, all played through massive speakers mounted on half-tracks. The third act, and perhaps the most dangerous, was radio deception. Operators who mimicked the chatter of real divisions, transmitting coded traffic so convincing that even Allied intelligence sometimes mistook them for authentic. Together, it was a masterpiece of military theater. That morning, Lieutenant John Jarvie, one of the sound technicians, climbed a ridge overlooking the valley. He carried with him reels of acetate tape labeled Tank Call Number 3 and ENAMF Movement A. The recordings had been made in England months earlier, every sound of a U.S. division captured in meticulous detail. The creak of treads, the rumble of convoys, the thud of heavy artillery being moved. Jarvie's team had engineered a portable sound system that could project those noises up to 15 miles, modulating the volume to mimic distance. As he connected the cables and adjusted the playback dials, the valley began to tremble with the sound of an army that didn't exist. From far away, it was indistinguishable from reality. The earth itself seemed to hum with motion. Trucks shifting gears, tanks revving, voices echoing between hills. Even the birds fell silent. To the German reconnaissance units listening beyond the Moselle, it was confirmation. A powerful U.S. division had entrenched itself here. The 11th Panzer Division, regrouping to the east, reported significant armored presence in intercepted messages. In truth, fewer than 400 men stood on those hills. By midday, the deception deepened. Teams of spoofers took up positions in mobile radio trucks, transmitting coded traffic as if they were the 4th Armored Division. Every message was crafted with care. Routine orders, logistics updates, requests for fuel. They even simulated radio discipline quirks of specific operators, pauses, slang, abbreviations, patterns studied from months of recordings. To German intercept units, the illusion was perfect. Meanwhile, along the road from Ericourt, the real 4th Armored Division was pulling back for refit, its tanks covered in mud and shrapnel scars. The 23rd's false front was now the only thing standing between the Germans and an open path into Patton's flank. That evening, rain swept across the fields. The inflatable tanks glistened under it, their canvas skins shining faintly like wet armor. Engineers staked them down tighter, muttering jokes about rubber soldiers. Ingersoll paced through the lines, checking every detail. "Keep the tracks realistic," he told the crew chief. "If you park a tank, make sure the mud looks like it's been moved. They'll see that from the air." Every illusion required texture. The dirt displaced under a fake tread, the illusion of weight where there was none. To complete the picture, the artists painted dark shadows beneath the inflatables, brushed oil onto the ground where engines supposedly leaked, and arranged fake supply crates around campfires. Even the garbage was staged. Empty ration tins, cigarette butts, scraps of paper with meaningless scribbles, all evidence for enemy spies who might stumble upon the site. They were meticulous, because one wrong detail could kill them all. That night, German reconnaissance aircraft circled overhead. The men froze under their nets as the whine of engines passed through the clouds. The spotlights flickered briefly over the hills, then vanished. Moments later, faint flashes lit the horizon, German artillery testing the range. The shells landed short, throwing dirt and smoke into the air. "They've seen us," someone whispered. Ingersoll crouched by the radio. "Good," he said quietly. "Now we make them believe we're ready for them." The next day, Operation Kodak, as the deception was codenamed, went into full swing. The sound trucks rolled through the fog, broadcasting the thunder of columns advancing. Dummy artillery fired using pyrotechnic charges and timed flashes from hidden lamps. Radio operators pretended to coordinate an attack, while patrols wearing the 4th Armored's patches directed traffic and interrogated passers-by. Every movement, every sound was part of the performance, yet beneath the noise, the truth was fragile. The men knew that if a single German patrol broke through the lines, the illusion would collapse instantly. They had no armor, no heavy weapons, just courage and timing. In a makeshift tent that served as command post, Ingersoll met with Lieutenant George Reb, who commanded a small security platoon. "You'll keep the Germans at arm's length," Ingersoll said. "If they send scouts, let them see just enough. A few soldiers, some vehicles moving, maybe smoke from a mess tent, then vanish. No firefights unless we have no choice." Reb nodded grimly. "Understood." By afternoon, word came from intelligence intercepts the ruse was working. The 11th Panzer Division had halted its forward elements, assuming they faced a full armored division. A German officer's captured message described large concentrations of enemy armor supported by self-propelled guns. There were none. The 23rd had bought Patton 36 hours, enough time for the real 4th Armored to reposition and for reinforcements to fortify the sector. But the Germans weren't done probing. On the third night, a small enemy patrol slipped across the river. The fog was thick enough to hide movement, and the Americans didn't notice until a flare burst overhead, white fire raining down on one of the decoy tank lines. The inflatable vehicles shuddered in the sudden light, their rubber surfaces glowing eerily. The illusion teetered on the edge of collapse. Private Tom Lacroix, a radio technician from Brooklyn, was on guard near the sound truck when he saw the figures, 4 German scouts creeping through the brush. They moved like shadows, rifles low. Lacroix froze. He could have fired, but the shot would expose them. Instead, he whispered into his headset, "Captain, we've got company." Ingersoll reacted instantly. "Turn on the engines," he ordered. Within seconds, the loudspeakers roared to life, the deep, gut-shaking thunder of tank battalions revving up. Floodlights flickered from hidden lamps. From the ridgeline came the recorded clank of turrets turning. The sound was overwhelming, echoing through the valley like steel giants awakening. The German patrol hesitated, then turned and fled back into the darkness. When dawn came, the decoys still stood undisturbed. The men laughed quietly over their breakfast tins. "We scared off 4 guys with a phonograph," Lacroix said, shaking his head. But the laughter didn't last long. At noon, the first real shells landed. The Germans, convinced that a major U.S. armored division was in front of them, launched an artillery barrage. The hillside erupted in explosions. Inflatable tanks shredded and deflated like punctured lungs. Trucks burned. The 23rd dove for cover in shallow foxholes, their illusion now dissolving into chaos. For hours, the shelling continued. Men who had never held rifles before now clutched them desperately. When the bombardment finally ceased, half their decoy line was destroyed. Smoke drifted over the wreckage. Rubber carcasses torn and twisted. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the German barrage stopped. Scouts reported that the enemy armor was pulling back. The 11th Panzer Division was retreating east, convinced they had drawn heavy resistance and were facing a division-strength opponent. Ingersoll stood among the shredded inflatables, staring at the smoldering ruins. Around him, the men began laughing again, this time with disbelief. "They bought it," someone said softly. "They actually bought it." Later that day, a dispatch from 3rd Army Command confirmed it. The deception had worked perfectly. German reports indicated they believed 2 armored divisions and a corps headquarters were positioned in the sector. The 23rd's fake army had diverted thousands of men and machines without firing a single real shell. That night, as the camp was packed up and trucks rolled out, the men moved quietly, leaving behind only tire tracks and the faint smell of burned rubber. The rain began again, erasing their footprints. Within hours, it was as if they had never been there. Ingersoll climbed into his jeep, looked back one last time at the empty valley and muttered, "That's the art, boys. When the curtain falls, nobody knows it was us." As they drove away, the fog swallowed everything. Night fell heavy over Luxembourg, thick with mist, and the low drone of distant engines. The roads were slick with rain and shadow. Convoys moved like ghosts, headlights blacked out, mud spraying under wheels, as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops crept north toward the front. The date was December 16, 1944. Unknown to them, the largest German offensive since 1940 had just begun, the Battle of the Bulge. In the freezing dark, Sergeant Fred Fox, a wiry New Yorker with a knack for mimicry, leaned against the side of a sound truck smoking his last cigarette. "Feels too quiet," he muttered, watching his breath turn to fog. Beside him, Lieutenant George Reb studied the map by flashlight. "We're sitting right between the 9th and 4th Armored," Reb said. "Except they're not here anymore." "We are," Fox chuckled softly. "Then I guess we better sound like both." Behind them, dozens of trucks idled in a muddy field near Bedemberg. Inside the canvas tents, artists turned soldiers huddled over loudspeakers, radio dials, and reels of sound tape. The air was electric with the smell of oil and fear. The Germans had broken through the Ardennes that morning, striking deep into American lines. Chaos reigned. Units were scattering, roads jammed with refugees, communication collapsing. For the 23rd, it was the perfect stage, and the most dangerous one yet. They were ordered to hold the illusion of strength across a 15-mile front, impersonating the 9th Armored Division to convince the Germans that a counterattack was forming. In truth, there were barely 400 of them, artists and engineers standing alone in the dark against an army of tanks. Captain Ingersoll gathered his officers inside a makeshift command tent lit by a single lantern. The canvas flapped violently in the wind. "We've got one night to set this up," he said. "If the Krauts think we've pulled out, they'll rush through before dawn. We have to make them believe we're still here and ready to fight." No one needed to be told what that meant. Every sound they made, every flicker of light, would be watched by German scouts creeping through the woods. The deception had to feel alive, chaotic, disorganized, but powerful enough to convince the enemy that the Americans still held the line. Outside, the men began constructing illusions in the dark. Inflatable tanks rose slowly under rain and lightning, their surfaces slick and trembling. Fake command posts were erected under tarps, complete with dummy antennas and glowing lanterns. A small crew began wiring loudspeakers into tree branches, aiming them toward the forest. Inside a truck, Fox and his sound engineers queued up recordings labeled "Armor Advance," "Night Ambush," "December." As the first reel played, the forest came alive with the mechanical thunder of tank treads and clanking chains. The sound moved, engineered with precision, drifting from one end of the valley to the other as if a massive armored column was repositioning for battle. Between the rumbles came the murmur of shouted orders, boots on gravel, engines revving. Even from a mile away, it felt real. The kind of noise that made seasoned soldiers tighten their grips on rifles. It was performance as survival. The 23rd wasn't just making noise, they were sculpting fear. Throughout the night, they maintained the illusion. Radio operators filled the air with transmissions mimicking the 9th Armored Division's signal patterns. "Red 1 to Able 6, moving company to Grid 2, came one transmission. Another followed. "Fuel convoy delayed. Request air cover at first light." Each message, each pause, each static crackle was rehearsed like dialogue in a play. They weren't fighting a battle. They were performing one. Near midnight, an enemy patrol was spotted moving through the fog, silhouettes against the tree line. Private Sam DeLeo, crouched behind a fake tank, gripped his carbine tight. The patrol stopped, listening. Then, as a recorded engine roar burst from a nearby speaker, they froze. A faint hum of generators followed. To them, it must have sounded like an entire company on alert. After a few tense moments, they melted back into the forest, leaving only their footprints behind. Inside the command tent, Ingersoll exhaled. They're buying it. By dawn, the deception was complete. To German reconnaissance, the valley appeared alive with armor. Columns of smoke rose from fake cook fires. Jeeps moved along roads where there were no real divisions. Even aerial photographs later revealed what looked like entrenched American forces. The Germans hesitated, long enough for the U.S. 4th Armored to regroup and reinforce the flank. But the storm was only beginning. On December 18th, German artillery began shelling positions north of them. The sky turned orange and black as explosions lit the horizon. Reports came in, entire villages wiped out, convoys destroyed, roads cut off. The 23rd's orders shifted. They were to execute a rapid series of spoof operations, leaping from one sector to another, creating the illusion of Allied strength wherever the front was collapsing. They became phantoms in motion, appearing, disappearing, reappearing somewhere else within hours. Every time the Germans thought they'd broken through, they found themselves facing another division. At night, the sound engineers recorded their own improvisations, mixing new sequences to match the chaos. Explosions, tank engines, shouted orders, woven together with field microphones capturing real ambient noise. The reels spun endlessly, echoing through the forest. It was like an invisible orchestra conducting a war that didn't exist. During one of these nights, as snow began to fall, Lieutenant Reb walked among his men, checking the equipment. The snow muffled everything. Even the fake tanks looked eerily real under its white coat. He paused near a loudspeaker that had frozen over. "Keep it running," he told the operator. "If it stops, they'll know." The man nodded, teeth chattering, adjusting the dials with stiff fingers. In the distance, a real battle raged, the sound of artillery and screams carried by the wind. Reb looked toward it, expression grim. "We're actors," he whispered. "But out there, they're dying for the scene we're playing." The line between performance and war had blurred completely. By December 22nd, the deception reached its height. The 23rd was ordered to feign the presence of the 75th Infantry Division near Bastogne, the most critical stronghold of the Ardennes. The town was surrounded, its defenders encircled by German armor. Reinforcements were racing to reach it, but the roads were clogged and broken. The 23rd was tasked to make the Germans believe those reinforcements were already there. It was the boldest illusion of the war. Moving under cover of darkness, the 23rd set up along the western approaches, fields frozen hard as stone, wind slicing through their coats. They arranged dummy artillery in snowbanks, planted fake minefield signs, and projected sounds of convoys approaching. Through the night, the hills echoed with engine noise, shouted orders, and the clang of metal. To German radio intercepts, it sounded as though a full U.S. corps was massing for a counteroffensive. Reports filtered back to German high command, enemy reinforcements arriving in strength from the west. In reality, there were fewer than 500 men, half frozen, their fingers numb, their bodies running on black coffee and adrenaline. Ingersoll barely slept. Inside a tent lined with frozen canvas, he scrawled notes in his journal by candlelight. "If we hold the illusion another day, Bastogne might survive," he wrote. "If not, all of this ends in blood." Outside, the temperature dropped below zero. The sound equipment froze. The inflatable tanks stiffened and cracked. Men used their breath to thaw microphones, yet they kept the deception alive. For 2 days straight, they maintained the illusion. Without sleep, without heat, their recordings looping endlessly through the snowstorm. Then, on Christmas Eve, the horizon glowed red. The Germans were pulling back. Allied aircraft had broken through the weather and begun bombing their lines. The 11th Panzer Division, the same that had been fooled in Lorraine, was retreating once more, their commanders convinced they were facing overwhelming opposition. The 23rd had done it again. When word reached them, the men were too exhausted to cheer. They just stood in silence, snow falling on their helmets, listening to the distant echoes of real artillery pounding the German retreat. The illusion had bought time for the 101st Airborne to hold Bastogne until Patton's Third Army broke through. The war in the Ardennes had turned, and the ghosts had helped turn it. In the aftermath, as the snow melted into mud, the 23rd drove slowly through the ruined villages they had saved. Children waved from doorways. Burned tanks lay half-buried in the roads. The men passed without recognition. No medals, no parades, no names in dispatches. Their orders were classified. Their existence was denied. To the world, the 9th Armored Division had held the line. No one knew that the army the Germans feared was made of air, sound, and imagination. That night, in a quiet farmhouse converted into barracks, Fred Fox sat by the window, staring out at the moonlit fields. He scribbled a note in his pocket notebook. "We are not fighting men. We are the echoes of fighting men. We make ghosts for the enemy to chase." He looked up at the sky, the snow clouds clearing to reveal faint starring, and whispered, "If they never know, maybe that means we did it right." Outside, the valley lay silent again, as if the war itself had paused to listen. The winter of 1945 bled slowly into spring, and with it came a silence the soldiers of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops didn't trust. The snow melted into the rivers of western Germany, carrying the black smoke of retreating armies downstream. Bridges lay shattered, fields churned by tank treads and frost. For the first time in months, the roar of the front was distant, muffled by miles of ruined countryside. The men of the 23rd were exhausted, hollow-eyed from too many sleepless nights, too many miles traveled behind the lines. Yet their work was far from over. Patton's Third Army was driving east toward the Rhine, and the Germans were desperate. Every river crossing, every bridgehead was a potential slaughter. It would be here, along the ancient Rhine, that the 23rd would stage its most audacious performance, one that would decide whether thousands of real soldiers lived or died. In late March, orders came down. They were to stage a full-scale deception to cover the actual Rhine crossing at Remagen and Oppenheim. Intelligence had intercepted German reports, suggesting they expected the main assault north near Bonn. The Allies wanted to reinforce that belief. and the Ghost Army would make it real. The operation was codenamed Viersen. For weeks, the 23rd had prepared for this moment, moving in secrecy across war-torn Germany. Trucks rattled through broken villages, headlights blacked out, carrying crates of rubber tanks, decoy artillery, and reels of sound recordings. Alongside them rode engineers and artists who now looked more like veterans than dreamers. Faces drawn, hands calloused, but eyes still burning with purpose. They arrived near the small town of Anrath, 20 miles from the Rhine in the dead of night. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and diesel. Captain Ralph Ingersoll, ever the director, surveyed the landscape through binoculars. The terrain was perfect. Rolling fields bordered by tree lines, just enough cover to hide the truth but open enough to be seen by German scouts and aerial observers. "We'll set the stage here," he said quietly. "Let's make them see an army." By dawn, the illusion began. Trucks fanned out across the fields, unloading their strange cargo. Inflatable Sherman tanks rose like phantoms from the mist, their rubber skins glistening in the pale light. Dummy half-tracks and artillery were arranged in perfect formation, their shadows painted onto the ground to appear solid from above. Teams of camouflage artists worked tirelessly, brushing mud onto the vehicles, adding dents and scratches to make them look battle-worn. Nearby, sound engineers unrolled thick cables connecting them to massive amplifiers mounted on jeeps. When powered, the speakers would project the roar of tanks, the hammering of engines, and the rhythmic grind of chains, a soundtrack of war meticulously crafted for the illusion. Radio operators tuned their transmitters to mimic the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions, both real units fighting miles away. They transmitted false traffic 24 hours a day, messages about ammunition shortages, bridge construction, troop movements. German intercept teams picked up every word. To them, it was confirmation that 2 full divisions were preparing to cross the Rhine at Anrath. The stage was set. For the next 3 days, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops performed the greatest illusion of their war. They built fake bridges over small streams to imitate crossing points. They parked tanks under nets by the hundreds. Trucks rolled in endless loops along country roads to kick up dust, the classic signature of a moving column. At night, they lit fake campfires and flashed vehicle headlights in careful patterns to mimic convoy movement. It was theater, but with lives hanging in the balance. German reconnaissance aircraft buzzed overhead daily. The men below kept their composure, waving at the sky as if they belonged there. The air crews reported massive concentrations of U.S. forces preparing to cross. German artillery repositioned north to meet the supposed assault, thinning their defense elsewhere, exactly where Patton planned to strike. The deception reached a fever pitch on March 21st. The 23rd simulated a full-scale armored advance, complete with sonic bombardment. Massive speakers thundered with the sound of hundreds of tanks moving toward the river. Pyrotechnics lit the hills with flashes mimicking artillery fire. The night sky pulsed with light, smoke drifting across the fields in thick gray sheets. To anyone within 10 miles, it looked, and sounded, like war. In a nearby trench, Lieutenant George Reb crouched beside a sergeant, both shivering in the cold. "Think they're buying it?" the sergeant asked. Reb smiled faintly. "If they aren't, we'll know soon enough." At 200 hours, German spotlights flickered on across the river. A few minutes later, artillery began pounding the empty fields where the fake tanks sat. Explosions tore through canvas and rubber, sending shreds of inflatable armor flying into the air. The 23rd hunkered down, hearts pounding. They were under real fire, paying for their illusion with risk as always. When the barrage ended at dawn, the fields were cratered and smoking. But the Germans had taken the bait. They had concentrated their defenses away from Oppenheim, where the real 5th Infantry Division crossed the Rhine unopposed. In those few critical hours, the Ghost Army had saved thousands of lives. As the smoke cleared, Ingersoll emerged from a trench, brushing mud off his helmet. Around him, men climbed from foxholes, laughing weakly, staring at the remains of their rubber army. "Looks like the show's over," someone said. Ingersoll shook his head. "Not yet. Curtain call's still coming." He was right. As Allied forces surged across the Rhine, the 23rd followed behind, tasked now with keeping up the illusion deep into Germany. Their next act would carry them through shattered cities and across the plains of the Ruhr. Everywhere they went, they left ghosts in their wake. Fake depots, false convoys, decoy headquarters, each one confusing and delaying the enemy's response. But with victory drawing near, something strange began to stir among them, a feeling they had never experienced before, the awareness of what they had done. At night, as they sat around campfires burning low, the men talked softly about the soldiers who'd fought the real battles. "We never fired a shot," one said, staring into the flames. "But maybe we saved more men than we'll ever meet." Another replied, "No one will believe us. Hell, they might not even tell anyone we existed." They were right. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops operated under absolute secrecy. Every mission report was stamped classified. Their unit designation didn't appear in public records. Even their mail was censored to prevent mention of their true work. When they passed through liberated towns, people saluted them as ordinary engineers. Only they knew the truth, that their entire war had been a masterpiece of illusion, a war of imagination and nerves. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Towns fell in rapid succession. German units surrendered by the thousands. And yet until the very end, the Ghost Army continued to perform. Near the Elbe River, they executed one final deception, simulating an armored thrust that never existed, ensuring a smoother advance for real divisions to the south. When the guns finally fell silent in May, the men of the 23rd gathered near Torgau, where the US and Soviet armies met. They stood beside the Elbe, watching fireworks of tracer rounds fired in celebration. The war was over. For the first time, they had nothing left to fake. Ingersoll looked around at his weary soldiers, the artists, sound men, and dreamers who had fooled the German army again and again. He raised his canteen. "Gentlemen," he said, voice rough with exhaustion, "to the greatest actors who ever lived." The men laughed, clinking their tin cups together. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang for peace, but peace for them came quietly. They returned home to America without parades, without medals, without stories. Their work remained secret, buried in military archives for decades. Bill Blass went back to fashion. Ellsworth Kelly returned to art. Others became architects, teachers, designers. They built lives in silence, carrying with them the strange memory of a war fought with illusion. Years later, when their mission was finally declassified, the world would learn what they had done. How 1,100 artists, engineers, and dreamers had faced down tanks with rubber and sound. How they had saved tens of thousands of lives by pretending to be an army that never existed. How the ghosts they created helped end a real war. And yet, in the quiet between pages of history, one truth remained. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops were not just deceivers. They were storytellers. They understood that in war, as in art, what people believe can be more powerful than what is real. On a faded field journal from the last days of the campaign, a soldier from the 23rd scrawled a final note. "We fought with paint, with wire, with noise and light. We fought so that others would never have to. And when the world looked our way, we made them see what we wanted them to see." In the end, that was their victory. The war was over. Germany lay in ruins. Cities reduced to stone and ash. Rivers choked with the wreckage of surrender. Across Europe, bells tolled for peace, and soldiers who had survived the inferno began their long journeys home. But for the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, victory came not with celebration but with silence. Their war had never been meant to exist. They returned through ports still echoing with the clatter of troopships, their duffel bags heavy with sketches, photographs, and letters they could never show. On official rosters, their unit was simply listed as engineers. Their records were sealed under layers of classification. Even their families, mothers, wives, children, were told nothing. When they spoke of what they'd done, it had to sound ordinary. Bill Blass would later recall standing on the deck of a Liberty ship as it cut through the Atlantic fog, watching the horizon turn pink with dawn. Around him, other soldiers laughed, shouted, sang. But the men of the Ghost Army were quiet. "We weren't heroes in the way they were," he said years later. "Our victory was invisible, and maybe that was the point." Back in America, the country was exploding with parades, banners, and confetti, flags in every window, brass bands blaring through the streets. But when the members of the 23rd stepped off their trains, there were no reporters waiting, no cheering crowds. They blended into the masses of returning soldiers, swallowed by the great machine of peace. Their uniforms still carried traces of paint, not blood. Their rifles were still clean, some of them felt relief, others emptiness. After years of pretending to be someone else, it was strange to return to a life without disguise. Ellsworth Kelly, thin and quiet, enrolled in art school on the GI Bill. His canvases became experiments in abstraction, shapes and colors arranged with military precision. He never spoke much about the war, but his paintings carried its ghosts. Patterns of camouflage turned into pure form, sound turned into color. In his own way, he continued the illusion, transforming deception into beauty. Jack Macy, once a stage designer in New York, returned to his trade with a deeper sense of purpose. He designed exhibitions for peace, not war, believing that persuasion, not destruction, was the true art of the century. Fred Fox became a writer. George Reb stayed in the army, haunted but proud, knowing that the lives saved by their illusions would never appear in the statistics of war. For decades, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops remained a rumor, a story whispered among veterans, a shadow in the archives. Historians knew of their existence only as a code name, ghost units. The details were locked away, buried under layers of secrecy, while the world remembered other battles, other heroes, but the ghosts never stayed buried. In the late 1970s, a box was discovered deep in the National Archives, a collection of faded photographs, sketches, and reports marked Top Secret 23rd HQ Spectrum Troops. The documents told a story that seemed impossible. Inflatable tanks, sound trucks, fake radio transmissions. Historians stared at the evidence in disbelief. The files were eventually declassified, and slowly, the truth began to surface. The world learned that there had been an American unit whose weapons were art, whose courage was illusion, whose victories were invisible. They learned that these 100 men had faced enemy fire with nothing but paint and sound, that they had drawn German divisions into traps, saved countless Allied lives, and changed the outcome of battles without firing a shot. The revelation stunned military historians. But for the surviving members of the unit, now gray-haired and scattered across the country, it was something deeper. Vindication. In 1985, several of them gathered for a reunion in Washington, D.C. They arrived with canes and cameras, wearing old unit patches that hadn't been seen in 40 years. When they met, the years fell away instantly. They embraced like brothers who had been lost in the same dream. "You still painting?" one asked. "You still lying for Uncle Sam?" Another joked. They laughed. But when the conversation turned to the war, their voices softened. "We weren't soldiers the way others were," said one veteran, staring at his hands. "But we were there. We were part of it. We made the enemy see what we wanted them to see. And if that's not power, I don't know what is." For the first time, the Army began to acknowledge their service. The term tactical deception entered official doctrine, studied by military academies around the world. The Ghost Army's legacy spread beyond history books. It became a philosophy, that imagination could be as lethal, as strategic, as steel. Filmmakers and journalists began uncovering their story. Interviews were recorded, trembling voices recalling nights in the snow, the thunder of fake engines, the terror of real shells. "We were just kids," one said. "Kids pretending to be giants." The Smithsonian exhibited their sketches in inflatable decoys. Museums displayed the massive loudspeakers and fragments of rubber armor. Visitors stared in awe, realizing that behind the myth of victory had always been men with pencils and brushes, not rifles. But the greatest recognition came late, almost too late. In 2022, nearly 8 decades after their war ended, the United States Congress awarded the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal, honoring their extraordinary heroism and ingenuity. A handful of surviving veterans, their faces lined, their hands trembling, stood before the cameras as the medal was presented. On its surface, engraved in shining relief, were the words, "Deceive, disrupt, defend." Tears rolled down cheeks that had once been covered in mud. They had waited a lifetime to be seen. One of them, 99-year-old John Jarvie, the sound engineer who had once mixed tank noises in the fog of Lorraine, was asked how it felt to finally be recognized. He smiled faintly and said, "We weren't looking for medals. We were looking to make it home." But it's good to know that history finally heard our noise. He laughed, softly, the same laugh that once echoed through cold French fields as the fake tanks deflated at dawn. As the ceremony ended, a journalist asked one of the veterans if he thought deception had a place in modern war. The old man thought for a long time before answering. Deception, he said, isn't just a weapon. It's a warning. It reminds us that truth is fragile, that belief can be built or broken by what we choose to show. In war, that saved lives. In peace, it can save souls. When the cameras turned away, the veterans sat together in silence, watching the crowd drift out of the hall. The world had finally seen them, not as tricksters, but as soldiers of imagination. The ghosts had stepped into the light. In the decades since, their story has become legend, retold in documentaries, classrooms, and art studios. Modern militaries study their operations as blueprints for psychological warfare. But for artists and storytellers, the Ghost Army remains something greater, a symbol of creativity against chaos, proof that the human mind can be as powerful as any weapon forged in steel. At the heart of every great deception lies empathy, the ability to understand what someone else will see, what they will fear, what they will believe. That was the true genius of the 23rd. They understood their enemy not as monsters but as men who could be misled by the same illusions that fooled the rest of humanity. In that understanding lay their power. Their story asks an eternal question. What if the art that saves lives is never seen? What if the greatest heroes are the ones who never appear in the history books, whose victories vanish like mist at sunrise? The Ghost Army's answer was simple. They didn't need monuments. They didn't need fame. Their reward was the silence that followed, the peace earned through deception. In the end, they left behind no statues, only ghosts, not the kind that haunt battlefields, but the kind that inspire them. The kind that remind us that imagination, courage, and art can stand where bullets cannot. And if you walk today along the quiet fields of Lorraine or the banks of the Rhine, you can still feel it, the faint echo of engines that never existed, voices whispering through the wind, laughter of men who fought their war with air and sound. Their story remains a masterpiece hidden in plain sight. The daydream that defeated an empire, the legacy of the 23rd Headquarters Special. Troops' lives not in the battles they fought, but in the illusions they created. They proved that truth in the hands of artists can be sharper than any blade, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply to make the enemy believe.